Topics in Volume 2, Chapter 9, Part 2 of 3. Letter to Watterson. George W. Julian. Tilden discourages his nephew and namesake from embarking in politics. R.B. Minturn, Manning's illness and retirement from the Treasury. History of the Monroe Doctrine. The Broadway Railroad. Advice to Governor Hill against the proposed enlargement of the Erie Canal. Favors the bill for an international park and for the protection of the Adirondack forests. Mr. Tilden was reluctant to believe that Mr. Cleveland had deliberately determined to proscribe his friends, and in spite of the apparent discrepancy between his reported declarations to Mr. Manning in the fall of 1884, and his action in the construction of his cabinet in 1885, had, till now, affected to believe that the novelty of Mr. Cleveland's position, his inexperience, his extremely limited acquaintance with the prominent figures in the arena of federal politics, and the intoxications of an unexpected and inexplicable elevation, were all transient conditions, and might safely be left to the remedial influences of time. To his friend Watterson, who had inferred that he or his friends were not sharing in fair proportions the results of Mr. Tilden's presumed influence with the President, he wrote the following letter, designed apparently to apologize for or extenuate the conduct of the President. It will be observed that this letter was written within a month after the inauguration, and 8 months before the appearance of his letter to Mr. Carlyle, and that it reveals to some extent the change which his relations with the President were already undergoing. Tilden to Watterson. Greystone, Yonkers, New York, March 26, 1885. Dear Mr. Watterson, your vision of the triumphant set you mention is an illusion. Mr. Green is less jubilant than you. Mr. Weed expects nothing and desires nothing. Neither of them is excited with a sense of influence. Mr. Manning was coerced into the Treasury. Mr. Whitney alone, of all your New York friends whom you imagine in power and forgetting you, can be considered as successful. Others who might be regarded as more particular friends of yours have sought nothing, and no search warrant has been issued to find them out and install them in illustrious positions. On the whole, your momentary sense of neglect by old friends passed away because it had no basis in fact. As to your conduct at the convention in respect to the formation of the platform, my information is that it was as meritorious as you state it to have been. I do not doubt that practical men tending to the views of both sides could sit down in a corner and agree upon a reasonable measure dictation of personal or local feeling for revenue reform which would satisfy you, and in which you would especially aid in the concoction. The administration has a difficult, if not an impossible, task in respect to appointments. Mr. Cleveland cannot be expected to know men in all parts of the country. He ought to try to deal impartially and equitably by every class. I do not doubt that he is desirous to do so. It is a very different matter to stand before the country as the responsible author of an appointment, or to ask that appointment under the dictation of personal or local feeling. Some allowance ought, therefore, to be made for disappointments. And the appointing power, when asked to do what it cannot, should soften a refusal by patient hearing, by frank and friendly explanation, and by seeking occasion to do some equivalent act denoting a disposition to be considerate of the interest disappointed. It is not every hand that has the slight, even if the requisite knowledge of men and access to the best sources of information be possessed. It is related of 2 famous New York governors that a man applied to Governor Tompkins for an executive favor, who in his own gracious manner refused it, and afterwards to Governor Clinton, who granted it, and that he came away much better pleased with Tompkins than with Clinton. Besides, it must be recollected that the Democratic Party has now been 24 years out of power, and has had no means of educating trained party leaders. In England the government is carried on by parliamentary leaders, and the oratorical or debating faculty is of great consequence. In this country the government must be carried on by popular leaders, and a capacity for party leadership is essential. In both, government has to be carried on through by human beings, a fact too often forgotten by theorists. I depended on ideas as a political force more liberally and less on party machinery than anybody else has done. What is called patronage I never had to any appreciable extent, and yet I held my ascendancy with the democratic masses of this state when I had to confront the adverse influence of the executive, of the heads of departments, of the judiciary, and of the majority of the voters of this state against at least 20,000 office holders. I carried politics upon a plane which approached to the impracticable. I do not exact of anybody else to encounter the risks I ran, or to imitate so adventurous a policy. For there was no moment in which I was not willing to be consigned to private life. It seems to me sometimes remarkable to hear men called great leaders who, while swaying all the patronage of the country, federal, state, and local, failed to hold their own party, or to hold a majority of the people. The Republican mischief-makers of the press must be expected to try to array the Democratic Party into contending factions, as, for instance, the Friends of Carlisle and the Friends of Randall, and they sometimes classify me in these divisions. I am sure you know me too well to think that there is any truth in such representations so far as concerns me. If I were really exercising the power of the government, would dispel such fables. I do not think the administration means to give any occasion for such gossip. For my part, I substantially pursue the policy of non-interference in the distribution of appointments by the national administration. Aside from other considerations which require this reserve from me, the totally unfounded gossip of the journals, that Mr. Tilden's hand is seen in this or in that, already swells my mail to dimensions impossible to answer or even to read. If I were really to take an active part in appointments, it would impose upon me a burden of correspondence which I could not endure. I began to write you a short letter, but have been thinking aloud until my letter has outgrown my intention. Very truly yours, S. J. Tilden. Soon after Mr. Cleveland's inauguration, Mr. Tilden had written Mr. Manning advising the appointment of Honorable George W. Julian of Indiana as Commissioner of the General Land Office, and suggesting that his letter be shown to the President and to Mr. Lamar, the Secretary of the Interior. After enumerating the evidences of his abundant qualifications for this office, he said, "I think it would be a most admirable appointment. Considering that he was an original anti-slavery man, it would be a graceful act in Mr. Lamar to favor him. It would show how completely the lion and the lamb had laid down together, and would tend to conciliate a powerful class in the northern states. If the lion had laid down with the lamb, it appeared, in this case, that one had laid down inside of the other, for Mr. Julian did not get the appointment." In reply to a letter from Mr. Julian, thanking Mr. Tilden for his effort, and announcing his own disappointment, Mr. Tilden said, Tilden to George W. Julian. Greystone, Yonkers, New York, March 24, 1885. Dear Mr. Julian, I am extremely sorry to learn that you are not to be Commissioner of the Land Office. My letter presented your case as strongly as possible, and I presume was communicated according to the request it contained, although I have not heard from Mr. Manning since. But I do not ascribe so much potentially to it as you seem inclined to do. Men in power generally have their plans, and take their views which they prefer to the wishes of those who have ceased to have power. I hope that there may something else be open to you in respect to which you may have better success. Very truly yours, S. J. Tilden. In point of fact, no one who had taken any active interest in establishing Mr. Tilden's claims to the presidency before the Electoral Commission, or in securing the testimony establishing the fraudulent character of the votes which were made the pretext for electing Hayes, ever received any recognition from Mr. Cleveland, not even those in whose fortunes Mr. Tilden took the trouble, which ought to have been unnecessary, to express to the President his personal interest. And as if to leave the friends of Mr. Tilden in no doubt as to the significance of this policy, he appointed to an important office Mr. E. H. Noyes, of Ohio, who had been one of the visiting statesmen selected by Chandler to hold Florida, and whose defense of the Alachua fraud was of so gross and scandalous a character that nothing less than the mission to France was deemed by the principal beneficiary of that fraud a sufficient compensation. In the fall of this year the rumor reached Mr. Tilden that one of his nephews was talked of for a place on the state ticket in New York. The following letter which he addressed to his nephew shows that, as early as September, 1885, he was no longer under any illusions in regard to the attitude of the administration towards him. Tilden to his nephew, Greystone, Yonkers, New York, September 1, 1885. My dear nephew, in my judgment you should not entertain the slightest doubt in respect to going on the state ticket this fall, if that is within your power. Both your interest and your duty require that you should refuse any opportunity if it should open to you. I should look upon your embarking upon a political career as total ruin to your business interests, to your independence, and to your whole future. You cannot afford the expense of such a career. You cannot afford to pay even the first assessment. You cannot afford to withdraw your attention from your business. To do so would be unjust to your brother and to your creditors. I have felt much concern in respect to your growing taste for politics. You have now reached a fork in the road when you must choose whether you will aim at pecuniary independence, safety, and comfort, or whether you will consent to become a mere hanger-on to the uncertain chances of politics. Besides, if you were to enter upon a political career, you could not select a worse time in which to do it than this fall. The elements were never more uncertain. You would be foolish to take the chances now, even if you should do it hereafter. I write strongly, because I see clearly the complications which your becoming a candidate now would involve. If you wish to see me on the subject, I can tell you things which I cannot write. Very truly yours, S. J. Tilden. Nor were the relations between Mr. Manning and the President much less, if at all less, strained before the close of their first official year than with Mr. Tilden. In reply to some complimentary lines from the latter about the Secretary's first report, and congratulations upon the manner in which it had been received by the public, Mr. Manning wrote. Manning to Tilden, Washington, D.C., December 21, 1885. My dear Governor, your note of the 19th instant came to me yesterday. Words of commendation from you have always been most welcome, but are more so now than ever, feeling, as I do, that I am living in an atmosphere that is full of mischief, and where the whirl is so great that one is inclined sometimes to doubt whether he comprehends his associates, or fully understands anything of what he is about. I think of you every day and of your delicate health, and often wish that you were here to guide us with your advice. Faithfully yours, Daniel Manning. Honorable Sam J. Tilden, Greystone. From this time forth Mr. Tilden refused to compromise the chances of any candidates for public employment under the federal government by yielding to their appeals for his recommendation. To his friend, the late Robert B. Minturn, he wrote. Tilden to Robert B. Minturn, Yonkers, New York, January 2, 1885. Dear Mr. Minturn, it would be at any time a pleasure to see you, but I am not in communication with Governor Cleveland in respect to his appointments, and think it would be better for you to say what you wish directly to him or through Mr. Manning. Very truly yours, S. J. Tilden. R. B. Minturn, Esquire. Mr. Manning, the only member of the executive branch of the government with whom Mr. Tilden was in correspondence, was prostrated by apoplexy as he was returning to his office from a cabinet meeting in the following May, and as soon as he was well enough to do so, left Washington and never to revisit again. After a few months' vacation in search of health, on the 26th of July he wrote Mr. Tilden from Watch Hill, where he was staying at the time. I want to see you very much to talk about my proposed communication to the President. I feel more and more, daily, that I need your assistance. Have you thought over the matter? Have you prepared a form for me? I do not know when I can get to see you. It occupies a day to go from Watch Hill to New York or Yonkers, and for me the trip will be a long one. Kindly clear my mind on this point. I do so want to decide on my action before the occasion closes. That done, I should feel comparatively free. My health is improving daily. My physician talks encouragingly, and I feel that I am better and stronger than when I left Greystone. To this letter Mr. Tilden sent the following reply. Tilden to Manning. Greystone, July 27, 1886. Dear Mr. Manning, your letter of the 26th is received. I have thought much of the nature of the communication which you wish to make, but have written nothing. Do you wish to say anything further than to announce your final purpose and your reasons for it? The letter, it seems to me, will be short. I will try my hand on a draft and send it you. No further intelligence has been received from our friends in Europe. I have been busy all the morning answering a letter from Mr. Fairchild. Yours truly, S. J. Tilden. The Honorable Charles S. Fairchild, who had been Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, was at this time Acting Secretary of the Treasury. The letter referred to here and Mr. Tilden's reply seem to have closed his relations with the administration at Washington. Acting Secretary Fairchild to Tilden. Treasury Department, July 24, 1886. My dear Mr. Tilden, you have by this time received a little pamphlet containing a copy of Mr. Morrison's surplus resolutions, a few remarks upon it by myself, and a number of tables prepared by Mr. Jordan. I wish to ask a favor of you, and that is to give me your views as to the probable effect of that resolution if it becomes law, if the effects may, in your judgment, be evil, the nature of the evil, and how it will manifest itself. If it causes silver monometallism in this county, what will be the evil of that? When is this likely to be felt? Would all the gold be driven from use, and, if not, what will be the difference in value between a gold and silver dollar? Etc. I wish to get all the information that I can upon this subject for immediate use. I do not wish to take an exaggerated view of the evils which may come, but, on the contrary, prefer for present purposes to under rather than overstate them. I know that you will be glad to help me in this, and hope that it may not be too much trouble to you to do so. Very respectfully yours, Charles S. Fairchild. Honorable Samuel J. Tilden. Tilden to Acting Secretary Fairchild. Personal and confidential. Greystone, Yonkers, New York, July 27, 1886. Dear Mr. Fairchild, your letter of July 24 reached me yesterday afternoon. I hasten to acknowledge and answer it. You are right supposing that I would be glad to help you in your difficult and responsible duty. You mention that you desire to get all the information you can upon the subject of your letter, for immediate use. Congress is stated by the public journals as likely to adjourn within a few days. These circumstances do not allow room for much discussion of the complicated topics adverted to in your letter. It cannot be doubted that the resolution adopted by the House, if it should become law, would embarrass the effort of the Treasury Department to maintain the equality in the market value of the different elements which compose our circulating medium. The United States notes, or legal tenders, as they are commonly called, and the silver certificates are kept par with gold simply because they are received and paid out by the Treasury as equal to gold coin, because the known policy of the Treasury is to maintain that equality, and because the Treasury is kept in possession, at all times, of a sufficient amount of gold to pay off any surplus of legal tenders and silver certificates beyond the amount which the uses of business can absorb, and because the public confidence that the Treasury has the ability to carry out its declared policy is thereby assured. Of course, every measure which impairs the resources of the Treasury or its discretion in the use of those resources weakens its power to maintain the equality between the various elements of our present currency. But as the House resolution seems likely to be materially altered by the Senate, it is not useful to discuss hypothetical measures. The present fallacy which infests the minds of many members of Congress is in counting large amounts of purely trust funds and large amounts of other unavailable funds as if they were resources of the Treasury. As to what would be the premium on gold if the Treasury should come to a silver basis in its receipts and payments, that is a matter of conjecture. In present market value, gold measured by silver is 35% higher than silver. I do not think that if gold and silver were to part company, the premium on gold would at once be nearly as large as that. Much would depend on the general opinion as to when the equity in market value between the two metals could or would be restored, and something upon the future cost of producing silver. Of course, gold would cease to circulate as currency and would take its place among commodities, and be bought and sold like iron and wheat. The deficiency in the currency would probably be supplied by paper issue. These questions are too speculative to be discussed or even stated with exactness in this hasty letter. It would be very desirable to bring both silver and gold into use as reserves for the basis of the currency, and as means of international exchanges, thereby doubling the quantity of the precious metals available for those purposes, but that object cannot be effected by the action of the United States alone. Very truly yours, S. J. Tilden. Honorable Charles S. Fairchild, Acting Secretary of the Treasury. Though Mr. Tilden had no occasion to waste any more advice upon the administration at Washington, he continued to take an undiminished interest in public affairs, of which to the close of his private as well as public correspondence bears testimony. His physical disabilities were gradually multiplying, and engrossed a corresponding proportion of his thought and time. His own appreciation of this progressive decay is given in the following letters. Tilden to Seymour. Greystone, Yonkers, New York. September 22, 1885. Dear Sir, I have received your letter of September, 1885, enclosing a slip cut from the Rochester Post Express, criticizing Mr. Bigelow's republication of my speeches, and speaking of my action in regard to canal matters, and also saying that you had written to him to correct the errors. I am much obliged to you for the trouble you have taken in the matter. I apprehend, however, that it may be safely left to the public or posterity to discredit or confute the writer's misrepresentations. I regret to hear that your health is so unsatisfactory. You have my cordial sympathies and my best wishes for the comfort and happiness of your declining years. I am myself, although somewhat your junior, subject to some infirmities which annoy me and create inconvenient disabilities. My eyes, happily, are strong, and enable me to read as much as ever, and my hearing, also is very acute in both ears, but I have trouble of my vocal cords which makes my voice weak and sometimes reduces me to a whisper. Some of my nerves of motion, too, are tremulous. Fatigue aggravates this so much that I do not travel, which I believe you are generally able to do. I should hope to see you if you should be able to visit me, were it not, as I understand, your hearing is impaired, and if we met social intercourse would be very imperfect between a dumb man and a deaf one. With my earnest good wishes, very truly yours, S. J. Tilden. Honorable Horatio Seymour. A few weeks later he gives some further and more interesting particulars about his physical condition in a letter to an old friend in Rochester. Mr. Tilden to Mark Sibley, Greystone, February 27, 1886. Dear Mr. Sibley, I have received your interesting letter. The newspapers are correct in saying that the 9th of February is my birthday, but some of them are quite astray in saying that I am 79 years old. I was born the 9th of February 1814, and was 72 years old on my last birthday. Although 7 years younger than you are, I can readily believe that you are practically younger than I. You have not done so much as I to exhaust the vital powers, and have not so large a debt to pay for strength borrowed and consumed in advance. My eyes are extremely good and enable me to pass most of my time in reading. My ears are both of them much more acute than those of most people. The doctors tell me that every vital organ is in strong and sound condition. But I have been for some years greatly annoyed by a mysterious malady of some of the nerves of motion, which imparts a tremor to my hands and impairs my voice so that I lose most of the pleasure of conversation. I have also read the brief biography of your life and doings which you were kind enough to send me. It illustrates an example of an active, useful, and successful career. Wishing you every blessing of continued health, and prolonged years of happiness and prosperity, I am very truly yours, S. J. Tilden. Note: a few months only prior to the date of this letter, and while engaged in a revision of his will, Mr. Tilden held a consultation with an eminent physician not in regular attendance upon him, at which I was invited to be present. I deemed the occasion of sufficient importance to warrant me in making a note of the diagnosis as it transpired. I quote the principal features of it. Troubled all his life with a delicate stomach. If he went out to dine and the dinner was served a little later than usual, he suffered from it. Used to surmount this trouble by horseback riding. Used to ride in Albany in '75 when the thermometer was 14 degrees below zero. Now cannot ride a horse, can only walk around the house and ride in a carriage. The shaking commenced 2 or 3 years ago. Some shaking in legs, aggravated by fatigue or excitement, with pulsations in back of head. Feels that he is growing more feeble and his grip less firm. Has had a cold about 3 weeks. Not usually susceptible to colds. Has not had one for 2 years before. It began with a slight cough and catarrh. Drinking makes him cough sometimes. He wakes occasionally during the night. Sleeps about an hour and a half, 3 or 4 times a night, say, 5 hours at night and 2 in the daytime. Never had a pain in his head in his life. Eats 4 times a day. Takes a great deal of mutton broth, beef bread, and a little, but not much, vegetables. Inclined to be costive. Uses enema of tepid water. About once a week he takes a cathartic of Carlsbad water, sprudel, or rhubarb and aloes. Takes stewed prunes meantime. Takes now 4 grains of quinine 3 times a day, 12 grains a day. This is his regular habit. The doctors advised more, but he held off, but was afraid to leave off altogether. Is not conscious of any effect of it except more strength, no effect on his head and chest. Had been taking, until a few weeks back, hyoscyamus, 1 table of 1/200 of a grain. 4 times a day. Sometimes of 1/100. The highest he ever took, less strength since and more tremor. Took quinine at the same time that he took hyoscyamus. Thinks he was worse when he left it off than when he commenced taking it. While he took it, was troubled with dryness of the mouth and corrugated tongue. Less of that discontinuance. Sometimes feels that he must resume it as a palliative. Has twice stopped the use of quinine altogether, when he was living in the country. Resumed it in consequence of a cold and painless diarrhea which weakened him very much. The doctors report his liver and lungs all right. 4 years ago, when he went to live in the country, could ride 6 hours. The next year he trembled, but could walk a good deal. The first winter he tried electricity, but it did him no good, he thought harm, rather. End note. Mr. Tilden neglected no suitable opportunity for pressing upon his friends in Congress his views of the importance of strengthening our coast defenses. In a letter to the Honorable Samuel Randall, of March 2, 1886, he dwelt upon the expediency of the government's purchasing Captain Ericsson's destroyer as a means of testing the efficiency of his theory of submarine guns. It is a special measure of economy, he wrote, for if it should turn out that a machine costing about $100,000 should be capable of destroying a first-class ironclad costing from 3 to 5 millions, the result would be to cheapen some of the necessary defenses. I wish you would send me the names of the gentlemen composing the committee or subcommittee whose province it will be to investigate and decide upon the appropriation necessary to purchase the destroyer. The gravity of the principle involved in what is popularly known as the Monroe Doctrine, in consequence of the increasing complication of the relations of our sister republics with foreign nations, furnished a special motive for strengthening our seacoast defenses which was not receiving the attention from the authorities at Washington, still less from the public, which Mr. Tilden thought is deserved. To assist in arousing a livelier sensibility to the dangers which were to be apprehended from this quarter of the horizon, Mr. Tilden prepared a compact history of the origin of the Monroe Doctrine, and some of the responsibilities involved in maintaining it, to reinforce his plea for strengthening our seacoast defenses. I give here the material portions of it as it appeared in the columns of the New York Sunday. The Monroe Doctrine and its origin. After the final fall of Napoleon and his second abdication, the Emperor Alexander I of Russia, the Emperor Francis of Austria, and King William III of Prussia, formed a league. Alexander drew up the agreement, which was signed at Paris by these monarchs, September 26, 1815. They christened the league the Holy Alliance. Its professed purpose was to regulate the states of Christendom on principles of Christian amity. Its real aim was to maintain existing dynasties and to suppress all revolutionary or popular movements. To secure the cooperation of the people, some of these sovereigns, especially Frederick William III, had promised to give to their subjects a liberal charter, allowing them practical self-government. But all such promises were violated. To this alliance most of the European powers except the Holy See and England acceded. The Holy Alliance held frequent congresses, and its policy was to intervene with military force in the internal affairs of any country which should attempt to establish less despotic government. At its instance the revolutionary movements in Naples and in Piedmont were suppressed in 1821. At its instance, in 1823, France marched an army, nominally of 100,000 men, into Spain, and restored absolutism in that country. Alexander of Russia assured France of his support, offering to march an army to the Rhine. It was known that the Holy Alliance mediated enabling Spain to reconquer the states of South America and Mexico. It was arranged that the Holy Alliance should have a consultation on the subject. The policy was avowed to Mr. Canning by Prince Polignac, ambassador of France to England, of ensuring, by concert between the European powers, the establishment of monarchical governments over the revolted colonies of Spain. Under Castlereagh England had refused to be a party to the engagements of the Holy Alliance. Under the lead of his successor as Secretary of State of Foreign Affairs, George Canning, she took a position of more pronounced dissent and opposition. She threw her moral weight in the scale of condemnation of the intervention of France in the domestic affairs of Spain. In the meantime the United States had recognized the independence of the revolted colonies of Spain. President Monroe, by his special message of March 8, 1822, recommended the measure. Congress, by an act approved May 4, 1822, made an appropriation to defray the expenses of such missions as the President might institute to the independent nations on the American continents. In 1823 Mr. Canning proposed to Mr. Rush, the American minister to Great Britain, that the United States should unite with England in a joint declaration condemning any attempt of the Holy Alliance to help Spain to reconquer its revolted colonies in South America and Mexico. In reply Mr. Rush urged the immediate recognition by England of the independence of the South American states. If that were done he offered to unite in the joint declaration proposed by Mr. Canning. The correspondence was transmitted to John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State. President Monroe submitted that correspondence to Mr. Jefferson and through him to Mr. Madison. President Monroe, after consulting Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Madison, availed himself of his annual message of December 2, 1823, to state the position of the American government upon the subject. The two passages of the message relating to this subject are here given in full. At the proposal of the Russian imperial government, made through the minister of the emperor residing here, a full power and instructions have been transmitted to the minister of the United States at St. Petersburg to arrange, by amicable negotiation, the respective rights and interests of the two nations on the northwest coast of this continent. A similar proposal had been made by His Imperial Majesty to the government of Great Britain, which has likewise been acceded to. The government of the United States has been desirous, by this friendly proceeding, of manifesting the great value which they have invariably attached to the friendship of the Emperor, and their solicitude to cultivate the best understanding with his government. In the discussions to which this interest has given rise, and in the arrangements by which they may terminate, the occasion has been judged proper for asserting, as a principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved, that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. It was stated at the commencement of the last session that a great effort was then making in Spain and Portugal to improve the condition of the people of those countries, and that it appears to be conducted with extraordinary moderation. It need scarcely be remarked that the result has been so far very different from what was then anticipated. Of events in that quarter of the globe, with which we have so much intercourse, and from which we derive our origin, we have always been anxious and interested spectators. The citizens of the United States cherish sentiments the most friendly in favor of the liberty and happiness of their fellow men on that side of the Atlantic. In the wars of the European powers, in matters relating to themselves, we have never taken any part, nor does it comfort with our policy so to do. It is only when our rights are invaded or seriously menaced that we resent injuries or make preparation for our defense. With the movements in this hemisphere we are of necessity more immediately connected, and by causes which must be obvious to all enlightened and impartial observers. The political system of the Allied powers is essentially in this respect from that of America. This difference proceeds from that which exists in their respective governments. And to the defense of our own, which has been achieved by the loss of so much blood and treasure, and matured by the wisdom of their most enlightened citizens, and under which we have enjoyed unexampled felicity, this whole nation is devoted. We owe it, therefore, to candor and to the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. With the existing colonies or dependencies of any European power we have not interfered, and shall not interfere. But with the governments who have declared their independence and maintained it, and whose independence we have, on great consideration and on just principles, acknowledge, we could not view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them, or controlling in any other manner their destiny, by any European power, in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States. In the war between those new governments and Spain we declared our neutrality at the time of their recognition, and to this we have adhered, and shall continue to adhere, provided no change shall occur which, in the judgment of the competent authorities of this government, shall make a correspondence change on the part of the United States indispensable to their security. The late events in Spain and Portugal show that Europe is still unsettled. Of this important fact no stronger proof can be adduced than that the Allied powers should have thought it proper, on a principle satisfactory to themselves, to have interposed by force in the internal Tilden concerns of Spain. To what extent such interposition may be carried on the same principle is a question to which all independent powers whose governments differ from theirs are interested, even those most remote, and surely none more so than the United States. Our policy in regard to Europe, which was adopted at an early stage of the wars which have so long agitated that quarter of the globe, nevertheless remains the same, which is, not to interfere in the internal concerns of any of its powers, to consider the government de facto as the legitimate government for us, to cultivate friendly relations with it, and to preserve those relations by a frank, firm, and manly policy, meeting, in all instances, the just claims of every power, submitting to injuries from none. But in regard to these continents, circumstances are eminently and conspicuously different. It is impossible that the Allied powers should extend their political system to any portion of either continent without endangering our peace and happiness, nor can anyone believe that our southern brethren, if left to themselves, would adopt it of their own accord. It is equally impossible, therefore, that we should behold such interposition, in any form, with indifference. If we look to the comparative strength and resources of Spain and those new governments, and their distance from each other, it must be obvious that she can never subdue them. It is still the true policy of the United States to leave the parties to themselves, in the hope that other powers will pursue the same course. These passages were undoubtedly written by John Quincy Adams, and assented to and adopted by President Monroe. President Monroe had previously written to Mr. Jefferson asking his advice upon the subject, and requesting him to consult Mr. Madison. He had also sent to Mr. Jefferson a correspondence between Richard Rush, United States Minister at London, and George Canning, Foreign Secretary of State for Great Britain. Mr. Jefferson's reply was as follows. Monticello, October 24, 1823. Dear Sir, the question presented by the letters you have sent me is the most momentous which has ever been offered to my contemplation since that of independence. That made us a nation, this sets our compass and points the course which we are to steer through the ocean of time opening on us. And never could we embark upon it under any circumstances more auspicious. Our first and fundamental maxim should be, never to tangle ourselves in the broils of Europe. Our second, never to suffer Europe to intermeddle with cisatlantic affairs. America, North and South, has a set of interests distinct from those of Europe, and peculiarly her own. She should, therefore, have a system of her own, separate and apart from that of Europe. While the last is laboring to become the domicile of despotism, our endeavor should surely be to make our hemisphere that of freedom. One nation, most of all, could disturb us in this pursuit. She now offers to lead, aid, and accompany us in it. By acceding to her proposition we detach her from the bands, bring her mighty weight into the scale of free government, and emancipate a continent at one stroke, which might otherwise linger long in doubt and difficulty. Great Britain is the nation which can do us the most harm of any one of all on earth, and with her on our side we need not fear the whole world. With her, then, we should sedulously cherish a cordial friendship, and nothing would tend more to knit our affections than to be fighting once more side by side in the same cause. Not that I would purchase even her amity at the price of taking part in her wars. But the war in which the present proposition might engage us, should that be its consequence, is not her war, but ours. Its object is to introduce and establish the American system of keeping out of our land all foreign powers, of never permitting those of Europe to intermeddle with the affairs of our nations. It is to maintain our own principle, not to depart from it. And if, to facilitate this, we can effect a division in the body of the European powers, and draw over to our side its most powerful member, surely we should do it. But I am clearly of Mr. Canning's opinion that it will prevent instead of provoke war. With Great Britain withdrawn from their scale and shifted into that of our two continents, all Europe combined would not undertake such a war. For how would they propose to get at either enemy without superior fleets? Nor is the occasion to be slighted which this proposition offers, of declaring our protest against the atrocious violations of the rights of nations, by the interference of any one in the internal affairs of another, so flagitiously begun by Bonaparte, and now continued by the equally lawless alliance, calling itself holy. But we have first to ask ourselves a question: do we wish to acquire to our own confederacy any one or more of the Spanish provinces? I candidly confess that I have ever looked on Cuba as the most interesting addition which could ever be made to our systems of states. The control which, with Florida Point, this island would give us over the Gulf of Mexico and the countries and isthmus bordering on it, as well as those whose waters flow into it, would fill up the measure of our political well-being. Yet, as I am sensible that this can never be obtained, even with her own consent, but by war, and its independence which is our second interests, and especially its independence of England, can be secured without it, I have no hesitation in abandoning my first wish to future chances, and accepting its independence, with peace and the friendship of England, rather than its association at the expense of war and her enmity. I could honestly, therefore, join in the declaration proposed, that we aim not at the acquisition of any of those possessions, that we will not stand in the way of any amicable arrangement between them and the mother country, but that we will oppose with all our means the forcible interposition of any other power, as auxiliary, stipendiary, or under any other form or pretext, and most especially their transfer to any power by conquest, cession, or acquisition in any other way. I should think it, therefore, advisable that the executive should encourage the British government to a continuance in the dispositions expressed in these letters by an assurance of his concurrence with them as far as his authority goes, and that it may lead to war, the declaration of which requires an act of Congress. The case shall be laid before them for consideration at their first meeting and under the reasonable aspect in which it is seen by himself. I have so long weaned from political subjects, and have so long ceased to take any interest in them, that I am sensible I am not qualified to offer opinions on them worthy of any attention. But the question now proposed involves consequences so lasting and effects so decisive of our future destinies as to rekindle all the interest I have heretofore felt on such occasions, and to induce me to the hazard of opinions which will prove only my wish to contribute still my mite toward anything which may be useful to our country. And, praying you to accept it at only what it is worth, I add the assurance of my constant and affectionate friendship and respect. End of Chapter 9 Part 2, continue to Part 3, to conclude Chapter 9, Part 3. Please share, like, subscribe and hit the notification bell for updates for the Life of Samuel J. Tilden audiobook series. Thank you.